So Professor Premesh Lalu is a researcher and founding director of the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape. Over to you, Prof.
Fortunate. Thank you very, very much. And to Andre, Michael, Dina, and to all of you who have supported my arrival in Abeja. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So I've been asked to do many things in my life, keynotes, this, that, lectures. I'm not sure why, but I've never been asked to be a provocateur or to offer a provocation. So I asked my 21-year-old daughter, and she said, well, why don't you just do what you do to me? Just shout at them. So I'm not going to do that. Some of the thoughts that I'm trying to put together for this provocation is drawn from a recent book. So I'm going to use this as a cheap advertising gimmick as well. A book that's just come out called Undoing Apartheid. And interestingly enough, it connects very well with the previous speaker because it actually has Seamus Heaney's The Cure at Troy as its standard kind of reference, the gift that was given to Nelson Mandela in 1990, and tries to probe what was the education coming out of the generation of 1985 that would live up to the promise of freedom and liberation that had become the major debate in the 1980s for the students who had walked out of apartheid schooling. So bear with me as I try to piece together threads of a fairly long, extended argument in the hope that I might put forward how we think about the question, firstly, of the Techno-Rational University and how we might constitute a space to rethink the question of the common good from the vantage point of the modern university. What truly lies behind our concern about the Techno-Rational University? And why are we to be concerned about the way it impinges on the ideals of the common good? If there's an anxiety that underwrites the coupling of the Techno-Rational University and the ideal of the common good in the title of this session, it is surely that something has come apart in the meaning of the modern university. Perhaps it is that the Techno-Rational University has run its course and has been revealed to have aided and abetted the emergence of an unfortunate predicament of a planetary crisis in which political contests over energy, food, and other resources of human existence are perilously under threat. In Africa, this impasse of the university now takes on various forms in the concerns about the effects of decades of structural adjustment on higher education that Teresa Cruz de Silva spelled out in her Codesra presidential address in 2011, in concerns about the creep of managerialism in higher education, and more capaciously, in the concern about the neoliberalization of higher education. Place alongside these the consequences of decades of colonial rule and stalled post-colonial transitions, and we have a dwindling of the commitments to the public good in the growing instrumentalization of the university in Africa. The situation is not unexpected in an environment where national states now seek a way out of the impasse of faltering development projects by way of a technological great leap forward. The more one casts one's eye over the emergence of a post-colonial intellectual tradition in Africa, the more it seems that we have been here before. And indeed we have. If we take the effort to glance back to the beginning of the 20th century, to the decades following the First World War and the aftermath of the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, we will find in the rising tide of anti-colonial intellectual ferment a deep anxiety about Africa in the world. As a first generation of intellectuals of the Black Atlantic reflected on the belief that the pursuits of education would lead them out of the morass of the racial remains of slavery and colonialism, they realized that a new vista of race was opening up before them. Many of them panicked at the speed of an approaching catastrophe that threatened to engulf Africans in a perpetual cycle of servitude, this time propelled by new mechanisms of communication technologies and the techniques of population control that would pave the way for urbanized forms of labor. The panic arose as traditional civilization concepts of race were replaced by a technologically charged idea of race. This was a period that Donna Jones, the African-American scholar, describes as constituted by the racial discourses of life philosophy. For Jones, the burden of racial discourses in life philosophy fell to Africans, leaving intellectuals of the Black Atlantic scurrying to uphold their commitments to humanism while guarding against the virulent reinvention of race that threatened to surrender African life to a mere form of mechanized existence. Two examples from the archive of African thought helps to support the claim I am making about the reinvention of race at the turn of the 20th century. The first is A.M. Césaire, who rather optimistically believed that Africa's putative failure in technology revealed a superior epistemology that had persisted beyond the rationalization of the slaughter of the Great War in Europe. In other words, Césaire was saying that the underdevelopment of Africa may have been its saving grace as Europe went to the slaughter, because Africans could hold on to a concept of humanism that it had been fighting colonialism with, that had been instrumental, to use a better word, that had been critical in its fight against colonialism. And Césaire thought that there was the possibility created by this decline of Europe's very existence for Africa to emerge as a forceful intellectual claim in the modern world. And that he believed that somehow a concept of humanism that had been brewing in Africa amongst its intellectuals, amongst its populations that struggled against colonialism, could be mobilized to that effect. The second example from the archive of African thought is the Nigerian literary theorist Abiola Irele and his book, The African Imagination, which argues that movements such as negritude provided a poetic form to realign sense and perception that had been de-linked by the pseudo-scientific orthodoxy flowing from colonial and industrial expansion. So Césaire, on the one hand, optimistic, and Irele trying to think a little bit ahead about what this reserve capacity of Africa would bring about in the altering of the question of knowledge in our times. But both saw race as a recurring problem for post-colonial Africa and its programs of modernization. In other words, they were beginning to anticipate the uncanny returns of this question of race that had been the remains of slavery, were now the remains of colonialism, and that persisted and returned in more virulent and more damaging and catastrophic forms with time. The question then, as now, is how do we escape this circular causality where race increasingly signals the threat of ongoing civil war, and where it returns with increasing virulence with the onset of newer forms of technological instruments? The answer lies in a problem that only becomes available, I want to argue, with the end of apartheid, where the true meaning of techno-rationality emerges in the light of day to offer us a glimpse of the power exercised in the name of race. Beyond the violence perpetrated in the name of apartheid over more than 40 years, Césaire and Irele helped to link the problem of race to technology in ways that anticipated an undetected current of race running through the biopolitics of apartheid. This was a form of race that came to be known as petty apartheid, one that may better be understood as an apartheid of the everyday, in contrast to the ideological ambitions expressed through the idea of grand apartheid. So the claim I'm making here is that unlike our common sense perception of apartheid as one thing, apartheid was experienced twice, not once. It was experienced as grand apartheid, and it was experienced as petty apartheid. An apartheid of great structural formation, and an apartheid of the everyday, almost interminable, suffered almost uneventfully. It was a banal, near, as I said earlier, uneventful form of apartheid, one that was named petty apartheid because it conveyed a sense of being seemingly inconsequential. In the end, it proved to be so virulent in its force that it now threatens the very promise of post-apartheid freedom. This was a version of race that was rationalized by a university discourse over a period of 200 years, forged in the crucible of the abolition of slavery in 1834 and the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Also a symptom of this techno-rational tendency is a point that was raised in the earlier discussion today of how irrational the university has become. So looking back on how this concept of race traveled through various permutations, we discover that its entry and its depositing into the university as an object for university inquiry shows up as particularly irrational in various stages of its emergence. When refracted through the experience of apartheid, the Techno-Rational University presents an image of a theater of the absurd. In fact, it comes close to what Alfred Jarry, the early 20th century playwright, called the science of impossible solutions, or more simply, pataphysics. He invented a science called pataphysics as a science of impossible solutions. It is an institution set up for inevitable collisions between humans and the instrumentalities spiraling out of control. If you want one example, consider a case in a South African university where after writing a single authored monograph, an academic found herself demoted for no apparent reason, possibly because the text refused the expectation to abide by a political tactic of a senior administrator, or perhaps even because a single authored monograph showed a lack of appreciation for collaborative work. So it's a rationality that acts against itself through irrational means. The peculiar global problem of race, I will argue, has brought the university, driven by techno-rational impulses, to its knees. And as the absurdity of the university attests, the configuration of race that gained ascendancy replicated its most absurd expression in the idea of petty apartheid in South Africa, which unfortunately, like a Trojan horse, harbors the discrete compulsion towards endless and perpetual civil war. Effectively, as the Techno-Rational University produces ever-increasing collisions, and as it comes apart, it threatens to produce the conditions for ever more acute forms of race war. The only way out of this crumbling infrastructure is to produce new possibilities out of this reality. In other words, to inhabit this reality in a more purposeful and conscious way. I suggest we proceed by taking our cue from Césaire and Irele. Both saw how in the early 20th century, race came to resemble mechanized forms of life in which Africans were conscripted to a condition of immaterial labor. This objectification was not merely a result of the ascendancy of the commodity form, as was the case in Europe, but of a disciplinary nexus of race and labor in which African subjectivity was ensnared. They were not wrong, of course. The new, as we have learned from decades of stalled decolonial projects, of failed and betrayed revolutions, and the exasperation caused by the development of underdevelopment, will not emerge from merely remaking subjectivity out of the fetters of the old. This does not mean that we should not attend to the question of subjectivity, only that it is not sufficient in thinking our way out of and beyond the limits and constraints of what we inherit as the violence of slavery, colonialism, and in the case of South Africa, apartheid. This is perhaps what lay at the core of Fanon's cautions about negritude. Fanon, you know, in that essay on national consciousness, takes his time to explain what the pitfalls of national consciousness look like. And he's speaking very directly to Senghor and others to say that to merely parade around your cultural resources is not going to make colonialism blush with shame. You'll remember that beautiful formulation, that something more will need to be done, something additional, something more courageous will need to be done to outwit colonialism in its game of trickery and mastery. What is needed is a new possibility for the university to track the epistemic forms of techno-rationalism, out of which a discrete, modern, intractable, and technologically driven concept of race emerged in the service of global capitalism, and to exceed this wretched script. In other words, to find an exit from the impasse that is posited by the inheritance of accumulations of oppressive conditions. You know, there's a famous quote that famous piece from Benjamin, which talks about how time never passes, it accumulates, it hardens. And in some sense, Africa has experienced that mode of repetition of time, which has led to an accretion of its kind of oppressive conditions. So what we're seeing here are not new modes of oppression. We're seeing accretions of oppression, psychic conditions that can no longer hold against the despair that is foisted upon people. And I'm suggesting that the university has an unbelievably important responsibility now to think the epistemic conditions that have created, that have forged that impasse and conundrum. So the sources of techno-rationalism, and I want to just delve a little bit into the cavernous belly of the university, if you like, and just pull out some strands of what I think are the elements of this discovery that we might have to engage with if we are to find our way out of the scripts that we inherit. The sources of techno-rationalism will prove crucial for the university oriented towards the new. This will be especially important if we are to find the roots of a modern thinking of race that is a residual trace of techno-rationalism in the university and increasingly attached to new expanded technological instruments. So every time there's been a revolution in technology, what has returned to Africa is an idea of race, a hardening form of race. Whether you take the Industrial Revolution or you take the second Industrial Revolution in the early 1900s, where you had an expansion in instruments of communication and control, or the digital technology that we live in now. What we find in each of those instances is a form of race that marks Africa, that presents it as the condition by which it is related into the world and into the kind of planetary in a more general sense. So, such an exploration may need to return to the scientific revolution in physics and astronomy on the cusp of the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean and the Cape Colony in 1834. And I apologize for this. I know we all became humanists and social scientists because we were useless at maths and that we tried to avoid the science department and so on. Unfortunately, that no one told you that now you're going to have to go back there, you know. You're going to have to go back to those moments because a large part of the human condition was actually shifted and organized and oriented in that moment through these disciplines that emerged at the end of slavery. Here it will find a complex negotiation between the state and a bourgeois public sphere that made science available to empire at the expense of the slave. If we read widely enough, we will also find in the writings of Marx and Goethe a growing concern about the slide of the human into mechanized forms of life, in which the racial remains of slavery took on new meaning. In other words, where the European proletariat was beginning to look more and more like the slaves that had preceded. Marx writes, when he talks about wage slavery, for example, on why he chooses the signifier slavery to talk about proletarians in Europe, because he sees this descent into a hellhole of mechanized life. If you want an image of this, think about Charlie Chaplin, Modern Times, and you have this man being caught up in the machine and taken, he's on an assembly line, and suddenly you can't distinguish where the human is in relation to the machine. So, what we need to come to terms with is the way in which successive forms of technological change produce the human in particularly vulnerable and precarious forms. But most importantly, if we were to proceed along these lines, we will also stumble on a revised method of the university. And this method was called the consilience of inductions. It accompanied the birth of inductive sciences, and it is a process where evidence literally jumps from one field to another to produce a surprise synthesis. Thus, a theory of evolutionary biology could be developed through the hypothesis sustaining cause and effect in the physical sciences. Put it more simply and anecdotally, in 1834, one of the leading physicists from Europe, from Britain, John Herschel, arrives at the Cape. That's why in Cape, for those of you who know Cape Town, there's a place called Observatory. It was to map the southern skies. And on that visit, John Herschel had just written a book called Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy. On that visit, Charles Darwin arrives in 1836. This is on the eve of Afrikaner exodus from the Cape, what they call the Great Trek in the kind of fictions of Afrikanerdom. But it is also the moment of a huge shift in the way in which colonial society is beginning to kind of unfold. And so Herschel and Darwin have this exchange, and Darwin's on the origin of species is dedicated to the greatest living philosopher of his time. My suspicion is that that greatest living philosopher in his time is John Herschel. And that what happened was that knowledge of physics became the basis of an evolutionary science. You can't see evolution. There's no way you can observe evolution. But with the help of physics, you could take the hypothesis over into biology and make the claim if it was repeated sufficiently over several species. So the consilience of inductions was the great discovery of the 1800s. This is why the science faculties in our universities are, we talk of them as hegemonic and dominant. They have a method that allows them to speak across disciplines. The biologists can speak to the physicists, the astronomers can speak. They have a language that they share. And that language was formed through this notion of the consilience of induction. And it's important for what I want to say and present to you as a proposition. So if anything, this revised method in the physical sciences opened the space, unfortunately, for mythic constructions of race in particular to contest the dominance of reason by extending science to the state and public sphere. So what I'm saying is that effectively what happened as science decided to broaden its horizon, to become more public, ideas of race filtered back into the university through the back door, and new mythic forms of race took hold to the point where these were captured within the kind of modalities of reason. So I'm going to draw this to a close, and I want to make a few points. So perhaps most consequential result of the scientific revolution of 1800s was the discovery of the law of thermodynamics. An emerging dispensation on energy refocused the attention of the university on the future of the human as a species. As I suggest in the book that I've written, the question of the human and its energy sources found expression in debates about the metabolic rift in Marx and Engels, the human as perfect machine in Sergei Podolinsky, and energetic loops of active sensing by Wilhelm Wundt. Now, this name is important in South Africa because apartheid, I've argued, settled on the latter through the connections established between the rise of experimental psychology in the early 1900s in both South Africa and Germany, the period that also saw the rise of what Donna Jones calls life philosophy. The main result here was a delinking of sense and perception. So I want to call apartheid, petty apartheid, a sensory order, because what it did was it interfered in the everyday to disrupt the link between sense, what you observe, what you feel, what you hear, what you touch, and the perception. And what it did was to redirect that sense through these experiments into machines that translated into a concept of race. So if repeated you'll get a notion of race, which is why we say, why is it so intractable? Why do people not understand that this is just a fiction? It is because it has already been constituted through a technique of control. So the scene was set then for what might be called a sensory order that breached the psychic structure to manipulate populations. If these are some of the elements of the Techno-Rational University, we should help it along the course of self-destruction. But in the process, we need to guard against the threat of race war in the impending demise of techno-rationalism. The possibilities for the possibilities to think this reality again requires us to exceed the scripts of race in the university through a new form of consilience that aligns sense and perception. In other words, the work of the university now is not to delink sense and perception, but to find in the humanities and the social sciences a new linking of sense and perception. This is a university that proceeds with an aesthetic education. In other words, the university of the future in Africa must bring to bear its great intellectuals, writers, artists, performers, its musicians, its jazz musicians, to show us how to reorchestrate a relationship between sense and perception, to learn from the everyday, to engage in a process of learning to learn, and to constitute the university in relation to this new form of consilience. The danger we face is that we live in a world where power imitates life and life imitates power. That if we do not intervene in this moment, we will slide into a form of mechanized life, and we will slide into ever-increasing forms of race war. And we're already beginning to see this happen as the kind of rising tide of nationalism grips the imagination of populations across the world. So I'm suggesting that we have a window of opportunity here, and that the African University might begin the process of a form of consilience that has hitherto not been seen before. So my final point then, my plea, is that this university that we are calling for is one that proceeds with an aesthetic education, if only so that the university may come to function in the interests of the common good. I'll stop there. I've got 5 minutes. Oh, I can go on. I won't.
Thank you to Professor Premesh Lalu for that wonderful provocation. Okay. So we will move to the 4 disputers. So we have 2 who are joining us virtually and 2 who are present with us. Maybe they can come forward to join Premesh in front.
They exist in reality.
So our first disputer is Dr. Sharon Stein, who's joining us virtually, all the way from Canada. And it's in the early hours. I think it's just after 5 a.m. I'll introduce Dr. Sharon Stein. So Dr. Sharon Stein is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia, Canada. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. Yes, I'm joining from what is currently known as Vancouver, Canada, which is also, and has long been before that, traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So I'm going to talk today maybe more on the common good side than the techno-rational side of this conversation. So I hope that's okay. One thing that we are looking at is that on the one hand, we have a previous state of the university where there was an imposed consensus about what constituted the common good in general and of the university in particular. And despite the common in the name, it was done in the name of, the common good, but in many cases it was good that benefited some at the expense of others. And in the case of my home country, which is the US, one of the great examples of this is that, it's commonly understood that the origins of the public university is the 19th century Land Grant Act, which was in fact funded through, the expropriation of indigenous lands for the benefit of white settler students. So I think we are at a moment where the imposed consensus about the common good has kind of become unraveled. And on the one hand, an actual common good is more needed than ever in the face of the wicked problems that we face, but there's never been more difficulty and complexity in actually determining what constitutes the common good. So I'm going to kind of make this argument and ask whether, it feels like a problem that there's no consensus around the common good, but we know that the previous consensus was actually an imposed consensus. So perhaps this is also an opportunity if we approach it in a generative way. So wicked problems, just this general idea that there are problems that we're facing that are hyper complex, they're multi-layered, there's interlocking problems where a change in one place affects a change somewhere else. There's many unknowns involved, and there are very long timescales and uncertainties. So there's basically no simple solutions. Things that that our universities are not necessarily currently designed to address, although some of them are doing their best. And why in the face of wicked problems, we would need some kind of common good is because we need everybody in order to address these massive problems and their many complexities because they affect different communities differently as well. But we have this impossibility of a consensus around the common good. And I'm going to, draw out 5 sort of reasons why that is in the current moment. And one is that we are facing this cacophony of perspectives, and that's not just within the university, but also to go to the Techno-Rational on the internet, where you can find information about anything and everything all of the time. And it's too much, essentially, for us to be able to process and discern what is important and what isn't. And there's no real stable epistemic authority that has that epistemic consensus that we may have been used to. Although previously it might have been imposed, that imposition is also increasingly difficult, for better and for worse. We're also in a moment of a lot of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And we see that showing up in a lot of social fragmentation and polarization of perspectives as well, which again makes that commonness difficult to arrive at. We're also seeing, in relation to the wicked problems that we're facing, the poles of solutionism. So this idea that we can have clear answers, we can have continuity of the system, we can have guaranteed futures. And then the other pole of, it's a disaster, there's nothing we can do, which can slide into sort of this nihilism and hedonism. And thinking about, climate change as a good example of where we see these poles in play. We have climate solutionism, we just need green energy, or we have the idea that, what's the point? There's nothing we can do. We're already past the tipping points. There's also a context of sort of oversaturated emotions where, because of all of this uncertainty, complexity, and moving parts all the time, it's not just an intellectual challenge, but something that we are not necessarily prepared to face in an embodied way either. And so it's very easy to become overwhelmed, and people increasingly have sort of short fuses, and that feeds this sort of social conflict as well. And then related to all this is also intergenerational resentment, essentially, especially when it comes to things like climate change, of young people feeling like older generations have betrayed them and set themselves to inherit a world that is literally and figuratively on fire. So how do these things show up in the university, and this lack of consensus about anything, including the common good? So one way of thinking about this is just using an image of, a common statement that's happening, at least in North America, where universities are saying, we are committed to anti-racism and decolonization. But what you actually see is that the university community hears this in very different ways, even though it's the basis of one statement, right? So you have this full range of responses from the sort of racist reactionary on one side, which says, bringing in these ideas of anti-racism and decolonization is actually threatening the excellence of our institution, all the way to the other side, which says, these words are totally meaningless. If you don't make material reparations, then I don't care what you have to say, and everything in between. And so the question in the face of all this is, how do we actually foster spaces for critically informed, socially and ecologically accountable, multi-voiced conversations about wicked problems and about the role of the university in ensuring livable futures? And in my work, I try and kind of collectively with other people on my research team think through what would be the capacities that we need to navigate the university and navigate wicked problems. I don't have time to go through them all. But the first one, for example, we call diffractive dexterity. Basically, the idea that you can read a situation and a challenge and a wicked problem in multi-different layers, seeing that it shows up in one community very differently than another. And we might assume we're all talking about the same thing, like we're all talking about that statement that the university made about its commitment to anti-racism, but we hear very different things. And being able to intervene in all of that complexity is one of these capacities for how we might come together around the notion of a common good, despite the fact that we don't have consensus. Another capacity being this notion that what we call ontosympathetic resonance, which is the ability to actually attune to the way that others are feeling, in particular their pain, not necessarily feeling it for them or the way that they do, but actually being aware of how what we do affects other people, and being accountable for that, and how would that shift, our ability to think about something like the common good. So I know this has been kind of a whirlwind, but I think, my kind of conclusion is that we are not going to come to a consensus around a single definition of the common good. And given the historical imposition of a particular common good for the benefit of some at the expense of others, that might not be a bad thing. But of course, we still need to have some notion of the common good as we face these wicked challenges. So my proposition is that instead of trying to come to a definition that we all agree on, how could we emphasize the quality and integrity of the relational process of actually grappling with what the common good means and how we might get there, and doing that through engagements like this one that are grounded in trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability, and that also being part of the common good as an ongoing process rather than a static definition or thing we can sort of wrap our hands around. So that's my contribution for today.
Thank you to Dr. Sharon Stein. So we're going to move to our second disputer, Dr. Bruce Demons. He's the director of the Engagement Office here at Nelson Mandela University. So it's yours.
How are you doing, Mania? I'm doing. Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share some thoughts. And I'm so glad Sharon picked up on the common good theme as it relates to which the colloquium speaks of Techno-Rational Times, but I think complex, historical, and contemporary challenges that we are busy, that we find ourselves in, not only as a university, but as society. And so I'm going to blame Masipiwe now for doing this, Prof. Andre. I'm going to flip my presentation, Masipiwe, and I am going to present a case study. In my previous life, I was a teacher in a primary school, and there's been fantastic theories exchanged around how the possibilities of what we can do. So what I want to offer is an exploration and a demonstration as Nelson Mandela of what the possibilities could look like in trying to insert alternative approaches and narratives to think about our work. And this will also be a self-reflexive moment to think about the work and the way we're trying to explore our work. So I see in my note here, it's terrible listening to speakers before, and I can just show you I had it all neatly, and then all his ideas were fantastic and writing across. So please blame the previous panel and my fellow panelists as well. So the first exploration is just the idea of the language, the question of the language and the language we use as a university. And is that an opportunity for entry? Okay, or does it become an obstacle for entry? I will then use my particular mandate, the engagement mandate, because the engagement mandate is to reimagine how we could do things differently in the space and put the initial proposition that we have on how we think we could do it differently. Then I will reflect around the emerging lessons in trying to do this work in this way. And then finally, I will then end by focusing on 3 key principles and values which we think are important, that we need to hold dear as we do this exploration. So you got your theory, don't expect any theories. All the et als were before me, as one of my co-researchers once said in my PhD. What are all these et als that you're always talking about when we're trying to finalize? And then the key intention is to be provocative as well, so that in your engagement with helping us think how we reimagine our engagement processes, that you complement the emerging learning that's happening with a broad range of stakeholders, which are both internal and external. I make the argument, and I think from the first session as well, and this was a Google search, okay? If you look at the visions and missions of the various universities on the continent, strong emphasis, focus on society and humanity and being responsive to some of the wicked challenges to be responsive to some of the wicked challenges faced by society. The question here is, how is this demonstrated, not only in the architecture, but in the way we are doing things? I think that was part of the first session. People were wondering, so how are we actually experiencing what we'd like to experience through the critical university studies? So this is our offering, and this is the self-reflexive analysis. So it's first the recognition, thank you. It's first the recognition that there are a number of approaches to this work in the particular space, acknowledging those approaches, but then also becoming brave enough, I think Shireen Motalas, when she said, what happened to our political activism, to start inserting alternatives into the present narratives. And our insertion in the present narrative is to offer a converged engagement approach that seems different to the traditional stakeholder engagement and community engagement that tends to be more of a charitable nature. And so we've been having a series of iterations thinking about it, engaging across the various spaces as well. And these are some of the key learnings, challenges that have emerged. And it will be good to get some feedback on your thoughts around some of these challenges. The first one is that it's complex, it's not neutral. It's ideological, methodological, philosophically contested. And there is a need for deconstruction and reconstruction, both of praxis and systems. Because some of the challenges we experience is that we feel sometimes we're progressive in some of the alternatives we're offering, but then you go up against some of the bureaucratic systemic challenges that are not fit for the purpose that we are intending to explore. I mentioned that it's not neutral. How much grace, we spoke of values, how much grace are we prepared to offer in this process? Because we work with a spectrum of people, or as a colleague said, on a continuum. The one spectrum, we have colleagues that say there's no way that the university can ever change society or be part of really reimagining what a society for the common good could look like, because there's too much vested interest in the architecture. On the other side of the spectrum, you have colleagues that believe that the development of a physics app could have a significant impact on the socioeconomic challenges of our community. And it's within that spectrum, I think, that the notion of grace came up. And even with our communities, our external communities, that if we are in the process of reimagining and we are committed to a process, how much grace are we prepared to afford one another so that that learning, I think you mentioned the Premesh, learning by learning. Learning to learn takes place while we're doing the work in bringing about change. And so we argue for a form of what my one colleague states as a cultural facilitation, where that requires us to carefully navigate this, because as Freire says, the oppressor has to be freed as well, not only the oppressed. How do we facilitate it in a way that does not present a CODESA moment, but presents a response to some of these contemporary challenges faced by our communities? We also, the other lessons that we learn in is that it is time consuming, not time consuming, it takes time. I correct myself, language is important. It takes time. And when we look at the outputs that are required, do we have enough time to do the work the way we'd like to do it? We also spoke about the intersectionality of the work, the opportunity of speaking across the different disciplines and sciences and moving away from the notion of thinking of the natural sciences as the only science in the space. How do we converge in ways that allows the language to speak to one another? Then the last three are some recent thoughts that emerged when we were engaging with community participants, both from Cape Town and from our community. And these were our community participants that have been working for more than 6-7 years with the university. The first one, the first contribution was that the participants felt that we are but thin-skinned. No matter which side on the spectrum you sit, when critique comes from community, we tend to cower and we tend to want to defend. So how do we develop methods of engagement that allows ourselves really to be critiqued in the process towards change? The second is, when we speak of the common good, whose common good and for what purpose? Who defines the common good? And so the argument that especially our community participants insist on is that clarification has to start. We want to be there from the idea until the implementation. Don't come with the idea and then tell us this is our problem and this is what we need to fix. How are you prepared to sit? Because sometimes you might go in with what you might think is one problem, and as you engage with community members, you find that that is not actually the problem. Are we flexible enough then as institutions then to move to respond to the actual challenges of our communities? And then the final thought is, what is work? And I think this is where it becomes complex, because part of our work is really being immersed in authentic conversation towards relationship building in order to develop solidarities to respond to these challenges. But if you look at if you should look at your job profile, Jenny, do we allocate time for conversation, for talking, for real thinking, for deep, immersed thought around the very phenomena that we should be working together, co-constructing responses to deal with these various challenges. So, as an office, we offer the following three principles, values for consideration as we start thinking of moving beyond just the languaging, because I'm sure no one will dispute that most of the languaging is excellent and speaks to change. The first proposition is around space and how we engage, and Sharon spoke about that. So we are saying that we should converge the convergence of multi-stakeholders communities should be a conscious effort of drawing together both internal and external stakeholders to unlock the knowledge and praxis that enable us to better engage on grander issues that affect our society. The drawing together of these stakeholder communities recognizes the voice agency of all those involved in the engagement, which forms a vital element of a humanizing pedagogy. So the drawing together, and I think it was Terry was saying, is across multiple virtual. So I was wondering, is that the community? When we think of techno-rational, how do we think about it? So what are the key elements of the space and when we engage? The second one is, what do we have to offer when we engage in this particular way. And we then speak of the notion of reciprocity, which we define as the exchanging of co-created knowledge and resources through the principles of generosity, solidarity, co-creation, responsiveness, and inclusion for the mutual benefit of all the stakeholders involved in the process. Because the principle here around a humanizing engagement is that everyone has something to offer. How do we make sure that all those offerings are recognized as meaningful contribution towards responding to whatever challenge we are responding to? And then the final principle is that the recognition of multiple forms of output. And we say this output, these multiple forms of output, is best gained in practice. While we're actually doing and experimenting with these modalities, it will inform it will allow for a deeper informing on the scholarship of engagement itself that is meaningful not only to the institution, but to the very communities that we serve. So the outputs we regard from the curriculum in support of the students, getting them involved in more engaged work as it relates to service to society, to scholarly outputs that can serve, that can contribute towards the greater discourses around engagement. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce Damons. So we're going to move to the third speaker, who's joining us virtually. Professor Crane Sudin is an honorary professor at Nelson Mandela University, an emeritus professor of education and African studies at the University of Cape Town, and an adjunct professor at CPUT. Over to you, Prof.
So what I'm going to do is to perform the role as a disputer in the sense in which I'm reading the words. So I'm going to dispute a little bit here, colleagues. And my dispute here, and it'll be brief, is essentially that I'd like us to step back a little bit from the modernization and the over-determinedness which I think we are bringing to this discussion. So the substance of what I want to say is that I'd like to begin with a proposition that the university, and this is where I think Sharon left off, is structurally always in constant tension and contradiction. So contradiction is a characteristic feature of what the university are. And the danger, and this is my dispute offering here, is that I think that we are essentializing the university when we approach it and analyze it through only those outwardly dominant features which now come to represent the university. In other words, its managerial and commodified form. Now, of course it is that. The university is managerial and it is in a particular phase of its historic development. And the key feature of that historic development, and this is really important for our discussion, is that it has essentially moved away from the idea of publicness. The public good has been sequestered and appropriated in very particular kinds of ways. For students, it's been sequestered towards a kind of privatized form of virtue, which essentially is what propels students into the university. So the university becomes a private good. The publicness, which many of our universities speak of, and I'm very glad that Bruce spoke in the way in which he has here, because this idea of engagement, which many universities around the world have adopted, gives us an idea of those publics which universities are having in mind. And those publics are essentially idealized subjects of modernity, which are particularly characterized by a kind of sense of being fit for market. And this is where our research has essentially gone. And so I'm acknowledging that that's what the university is, and particularly what its dominant narration of itself is. But while it is that, and while we have to challenge that dominant narrative, I'd like to also say that actually it is a whole lot more. And that whole lot more is the complexity of the sociology of what the university actually is, which we don't properly make allowance for and explain. The university is not singular in any form. It is not consistent in its parts. It is shaped by contestation. This contestation arises in the fundamental commitment towards which everybody in the university might be looking, and that is the production of knowledge. Just simply holding that particular commitment in view instills inside of the university its essential, if you like, and what I call latent vociferousness. In other words, it is constantly multiplying in its diversities. And here's a curiosity, Premesh, because this is fundamentally what quantum physics is all about. I mean, quantum physics has brought us to this point that regularity and the way in which phenomena interact and work cannot be easily contained in the way in which classical physics does. And so it's a curious thing that we are in the hard sciences at this particular point to explain the beginnings of the universe, to explain natural phenomena, the emergence of human life. And we're now having to come to comprehend and deal with the fact that we don't actually understand the complexity of it all. I mean, where quantum physics is right now is to say that we're in the zone of almost impossible probability. And I am, thinking about all of that, want to say it's an enormously productive provocation to be putting towards us. But yet we work with old physics. We work with the physics of the late 19th century, that physics that you spoke about, Premesh. We work with the physics of the industrial revolution of the last 100 years. And it's that physics which has come to give us our sociologies. And it's essentially a sociology which pretends that it is able to explain and contain. But we are uncontainable. We are not able to hold all of this proliferation of what this knowledge is all about in one place. Commodification seeks to give us a way of coming to manage that and appropriate it by steering it in very particular kinds of ways. But what I'm saying here is that there is always inevitably going to be resistance to capture, resistance to appropriation, resistance to the ways in which this determinedness seeks to follow what we do. And it's going to be really important to, I think, use this to come to think about what this social space of the university is all about, and how one inserts oneself in that social space. I completely agree with Sharon about the difficulty of coming to a consensual commitment with all of us inside of the university. I don't think we can. I don't think we should. But what we should be doing is taking accountability a whole lot more seriously and recalibrating how accountability works in and amongst us. And it goes towards what you were talking about Bruce. We have to account for our ideas. We have to be able to say where our ideas come from and what the value of those ideas are. And we constantly have to be put to the test around all of that. And that can only arise when we weaken these boundaries between what we call hard sciences and the soft sciences. We need to be brought into a space where we can be constantly arguing with each other. And that argument is going to require that we go back to thinking that philosophy and physics are not separate things. They are a singularity, a single object of inquiry which we have to bring together. And it's in that we come to make arguments for what is in our common good, where we listen to each other and where we begin to come to new imaginaries that we defend, and that we find ways of giving legitimacy to, but also from which we retreat and take back the certainty with which we speak and how we come to argue for ourselves. So yes, so we are now in the space of this metricized, commodified techno-rationality, but we are also in the constant presence, constantly, of other things. And it's how we come to a sense of how all of this is brought into a space of reproduction. I mean, how do you reproduce conflict? How do you reproduce the capacity to be always arguing with each other without violence, without taking each other out? And so that's my 2 cents with colleagues, and I hope that it has made sense. Thanks very much.
Thank you to Prof. Sudin. So we're going to move to our last disputer. Dr. Ntimi Mtawa is a Senior Impact Consultant of Sahara Ventures and a Research Associate at the University of the Free State. The floor is yours.
Wow. First of all, I'm overwhelmed to be disputing my teacher. When I met him, I'm like, oh, he's not aging, eh? Because he's provoking people all the time, so he will never get aged. I mean, we won't take you to old age home. Eh? We'll keep you home. What's a way to be the last disputer after some of your seniors have spoken? What are you going to say? I'm trying to, when I was sitting there, I was trying to reframe my thinking again. Say, what am I going to say there? But then I'll try my best. So I thought I need to start with a question of what are universities for? And for who? That question is always in the literature. What are universities for? And being a historian, Prof, I thought you would periodize universities. And I was saying, why is not periodizing? The historian. You know, I thought you bring in the medieval university. You know, how do they look like? You know, what were the expectation of society from those universities? And then coming to Africa, the Tumbukutu, those pre-colonial, and then post-colonial. And what was the narrative behind, and what was the expectations. And we know for sure that even in the US, land-grant university have their own, its role, which they played. It was critical to society. They were established for a purpose. But in Africa, and this question always, me and by my colleague Sam, we ask, do we have universities in Africa, or do we have African universities or universities in Africa? That question we always ask ourselves. What do they do? What are they doing? So then when I got the invitation to dispute, and I saw Techno-Rational, what is that? Times, what is that? And I called my friend and said, what is this concept all about? And we start discussing about it, and then I asked, what are the key features of it? So that I begin to make a sense of them. These times we're talking about, and how do they impact university and the work that universities are doing. Then I say, okay, I really don't want to go too much into those times and begin to theorize them. Let me talk about common good, which is very much contested language. And I like Prof. So in the way he framed it. And I won't go far from his talk, because I believe the Techno-Rational Times has made university even more permeable to many pressures which are coming from outside. We know, and in South Africa we often talk about the institutional culture which comes with the legacies and other things, but in other contexts out of South Africa, what's happening there? What are the issues? Unemployment, graduate unemployment is real. You go to Tanzania today, a graduate is a motorbike driver, and that's his or her employment. So those are issues that we need to begin to think about. What's the future of work? Tomorrow a graduate who doesn't know how to use iCloud or Google Doc or e-filing will be irrelevant. So those are techno-rational time, I think we begin to think about. But how many people are left behind from the common good point of view? So I will think about these issues, and issues of climate change, economic downturn, issue of massification, who is going to university, at what cost? What do they get out of it? And how common is that? So I thought about not really bothering too much of myself to prepare something that is going to confuse the people here. So I just decided to pose questions. And I like my brother there who was talking about community engagement. I come from a community engagement point of view, and I'll give you this book to read, not give it to you, but just borrow you to read. Yes. When you talk about community engagement as being one way, a pathway to promoting common good, true, but what kind of community engagement? Because even community engagement has issues of power and privilege. Universities always come from a powerful position, and in the process of engagement, what happened there? Who is powerless? Who makes the most decision? So those are issues that we need to begin to engage with. But the biggest question I'm asking myself is, what is something worthwhile common about university? What is so common about university? What kind of research which is common, which yield outcome or product or value which is common? What kind of pedagogical arrangement which are common? And what are the common elements that can come out of those arrangements? But more importantly, I keep asking myself, should we actually begin to think about or to bring university in this conversation of common good? How do we quantify that common good? How do we know the indicators of it? I know in the morning we talk about caring, empathy. Martha Nussbaum speaks about narrative imagination, issues of affiliation, issues of global citizenship. It's fine, those are very important, but how do we come to that, to promoting those? In the context in which universities are operating today, there's the so-called Techno-Rational Times, which is always put pressures on universities in terms of competitions, of resources, students, but now technology is taking over. COVID-19 has brought a new way of thinking about how do we deliver our teaching, how do we do research. Now, within that context, should we continue to think about common good of university? So I wanted to leave that question to you. But more importantly, Prof. Lalu,
You can call me Premesh now.
Premesh, yeah. Although I still respect you because you taught me, I won't be too much hard on you. More important, I would want you to tell me more about, even if you're a historian, your sense, because in your talk, you didn't speak much about the commonness, the common good of university. I wanted that to come out from you in terms of what's your take about what's common about university, which extend beyond the boundaries, beyond the walls and the fences of university. What's common and how do we get there? How can it be yielded to impact someone who is out there, who doesn't have a privilege to have access to university? Thank you so much.
Thank you to our last disputer. I'm sure we are all buzzing with questions after such an insightful provocation and also disputations. So we're gonna have an open discussion. So we're gonna have 2 rounds, and then we're also gonna have questions virtually. So anyone who's asking a question must just state their name and affiliation, and also whom the question is addressed to.
Thank you so much. Excited. My name is Ibrahim Bahati, and I'm affiliated with the Human Sciences Research Council. I'm going to provoke everybody in this room. Since morning, I've had Marxism, quantum physics, biology, Darwinism, EDC, and I've had less of African epistemologies, ontological practices we can use where Ubuntu was just given as a reference. And that is a problem. We continue to center Euro-American practices as the originator of knowledge, which is on the corrupt and the appropriate, which is, we haven't all known that they are also thieves of knowledge. And we forget that Greece learned from Egypt, which Egypt learned from Kush, and maybe that Maslow learned from the Blackfoot nation, where we begin with self-actualization, community actualization, and that. So this is where I need to know, and Premesh, this is to you, what African or indigenous methodologies did you look into in your work that you think can absorb what this race war is just going to be? And the other one is, the other question is about this techno-rationality which is happening in the university, which is filled with power dynamics, of course, turning us into economic citizens. And we are not talking about internalized colonialism, which is psychological. Sylvia Tamari, in her book, Decolonization and Afrofeminism, says internalized colonialism operates as a software within African academies, creating blind spots of full-scale decolonization or decolonial assault, which gives us half-baked results. So what is the role of the African university in rewiring the mind of the African to reclaim their identity, but also to rethink their place at the global politics? And maybe anyone can be able to answer that. Then finally, and then I will shut up. We are talking about the university as a public good, but we forget the university was put in place as a civilizing mission, not to create intellectuals, but to enforce the rule of the customary law, to habitualize agreement and become economic gullible agents to the motherland, which is Europe. And this has regenerated ways, of course, which are also talking about funding for research in Africa, which is gated by publishing houses and copyrights, or we continue to be contributors of knowledge acting as just footnotes. Also where there are also older men and maybe perhaps few women who are contributors of this knowledge. So how can we be able to decolonize funding to create impact that actually brings us knowledge as also contributors of knowledge? Thanks.
So Abiola Irele is one of Ibadan's probably most important intellectuals. He visited us a few years ago, passed away 2 years ago. But The African Imagination is an absolutely critical book alongside Pashlele's work on the imagination. The debate on negritude is not over. Suleiman Bashir Jan has written African Art as Philosophy. is an attempt to return us to those questions. So, I could provide you with a reading list of, what it is that I'm interested in, but Irele and Césaire, more or less, were pointing us in the early 1900s to a problem in the question of race that is not an African invention. It is actually a product of a Euro-American episteme. So that the category of race that we inherit, not only in South Africa, but across the length and breadth of this continent, is actually produced through processes of domination and subjection. So the text that I work with in this book is Sidiri Molema's Southeastern Bantu. It was written in 1917, but only got published in 1920 because of the war. And Molema is a medical student in Scotland. And he's reading the entire Western philosophical tradition to look at what speculation is happening on the idea of race in Africa. It's an unbelievable book. When you get to the end of that book, 300 and some odd pages down, you realize, my goodness, he's saying to us that we are being sold a dead dream. And I'm saying to you that, they are, so you're asking me, which African tradition, they are people who are reading in relation to the Euro-American episteme, but beginning to ask us to think very carefully about what it might mean to exit the script, because there's a increasing sense in which a second industrial revolution of communication and control, technologies of communication and control that are taking hold of the African continent in very pronounced way. The end of the story is, of course, God's Bits of Wood, that famous novel about the railway line in West Africa. And you think about railways and you think about the extraction of resources, think about the Congo. We're dealing with a continent that has been deeply scripted by modernity. We are not outside of modernity. No amount, that's Fanon's statement there, no amount of hauling out of your cultural resources is going to make colonialism blush with shame, is an absolutely fundamentally critical thing for us to hold on to now. So we'll have this conversation because I know, this question is something I'm going to have to field, but I do want to make Europe responsible for the category of race that produced a condition of unbearable, of unlivable life. And that's what I want to do. I don't want Europe to walk away here. And often now, it's big news in Europe. Everyone's decolonizing everything. But the question is, what do we sit with, after reparations and after these debates? So we've got lots of work to do here. The thing that Irele and others point to, and which I find fascinating, is that race is increasingly beginning to rhyme with technology. And there's something about technology, something about the hidden base of technology, the iceberg. And we've as humans, we've co-evolved with technology. African societies and African history will tell you this again and again and again. We are co-evolved species in relation to technology. So just a long-winded way of saying, I'm open to the conversation. I don't think that, we must simply say that the African library has not been interested in Europe. The African library is deeply invested in the modernity that it is engaging with and having to respond to. I take so Crane and I will have this conversation, hopefully over a couple of glasses of wine at some point. But I am interested, in the way in which I didn't get to the third term in this technological development, which is cybernetics. Cybernetics is a circular causality. Automated machines. Norbert Wiener invented the term in the same year that apartheid came into existence, 1948. By 1950, he wrote a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, and he said, my God, this machinery is looking like slavery. And the reference to slavery there is the debate I've had with Minolo and Torres and others, that if Minolo has a book at the start of his decolonial project, which is Keanu. But if you read your own literature, 1976, the debate between where Harold Walpe and Martin Legassic write an essay in the Review of African Political Economy, they say that apartheid cannot be reduced to the question that Keanu is raising of decoloniality, because capital has intruded in ways that has shifted the field. So that's why I'm saying partition. So I asked Minolo when we were in charge, I said, what would happen if you started the decolonial argument with a text of slavery as an inaugural text? You have a very different permutation to what decolonial would mean. So where you start is also as important as where you want to be. So the cybernetic question then, Crane, I think our universities, are caught in a repertoire. So you go from meeting to meeting and meeting, you hear the same thing, right? It's a cybernetic loop, you know? That's exactly what the sensory cybernetic process looked like. And so, you know, in jazz, musicians tell you must avoid repertoire. I mean, jazz is jazz because jazz avoids repertoire. Speak to Abdullah Ibrahim. So what does quantum physics look like in relation to the cybernetic? I think that what quantum physics does, it tells you what it means to flip a condition of constraint into a condition of freedom. And this you will, if you read Brian Masumi's work, you will get a sense that we cannot be outside of these scripts. We inhabit them in very, very profound ways. So what we're going to have to look for are ways of flipping a condition of constraint into a condition of freedom, which brings me to the question of commonness. My former student who was in my first year class and once took a photograph of me, which made me feel very good as a lecturer because, you know, I thought finally someone's appreciating the work that I'm doing. But you see, if the university doesn't constitute a space of commonness, if it doesn't perform, not the performative, if it doesn't perform a theoretical modality, a methodological intervention of what it might mean to be in common, I would worry if it's preaching to society what it must be to be in common. So where you start again is absolutely critical. And I would say that the idea of consilience is not to iron over differences. It is actually to think about a model of commonness. And I think Shannon was raising this word that you know, will allow us to inhere the spaces of knowledge and produce the conditions of a flipping of a condition of constraint into a condition of freedom. Is this going to be hard work? Yeah, it's going to be. Because the question I have is, what do we do in our classes now? The students are all telling us, you know, if you teach a class, everyone is against slavery. That's true. Because that's the right thing to be, is to be against slavery. But when you ask, what is the foundations of slavery that have produced the modernity that we inhabit now, will you give up your cell phone? You know, that's a different question altogether. So episteme is what we engage in. The university doesn't need to be apologetic for thinking against its own tradition and its own kind of self-perceived certainties. I'm going to leave it there if that's just some way to get us started into this discussion.
Thank you, Premesh. I'd like to check if Prof. Sudin has a response, because I know he has to leave by 3:30. Then we'll take another round if he has a response.
No, thanks, Jay. I can't activate my video, but just to say to Premesh that I'm not disagreeing with you, but I don't think that just the full impact which comes out of quantum physics and particularly quantum, you know, dynamics has impacted even physicists themselves, and so they live in a kind of world which is quite separated. They separate the intellectual from the lived, and that leaves them trapped still in this old way of Kantian thinking, and it's asking people like physicists to be thinking about what the implications of that knowing might all be about. And it's an incredible provocation to be asking just about how we embody our learning, because the way in which you've been talking, I completely agree. I mean, we have embodied racially this learning of the last 400 years in very particular kinds of ways. But this other stuff disrupts that, you know, in incredible kinds of ways. And I'm really excited, you know, and I say this to Sharon, I'm really excited to be in the university right now. You know, it's an extraordinary privilege, a privileged space in which to be. But the accountabilities that come with it are so immense. that I would want to argue that we have so much to be defending with this privilege here. So thanks very much, Chair. I am going to have to unfortunately leave it there and catch a flight to come to see you all in time for this evening. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you for the opportunity to pose some question. The provoker in his presentation talked of structured and petty apartheid. And I find that that is very critical. And so I need clarity on how higher education institutions should reposition themselves to handle the challenge of the prevailing petty apartheid that is still existing in some African countries. Yeah.
Then we will take Prof. Nomalanga and then Bongani.
Thank you. Just maybe all three of you may answer this one. Why is it that the black management class is so good at enforcing, I suppose, I don't know if I know what the term exactly means, but these techno-rational systems? Why is the black management class so good at it? Let me make an example. Why did Professor Makgoba advance the most stringent corporatization at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, even though he himself was a victim of liberal corporate racism at Wits? Why are black, yeah. No, I'm asking you. The reason I'm asking is because of the obvious, which is it's so good and well that the black intellectual class understands the common good, but it seems to wield this power very strongly. So, yeah, so that's the one question. And the other is, Bruce, in terms of the so-called community, etc., the biggest problem I have with the concept of the community is that I don't think we've worked out as black people what we mean when we sit in a university and talk about the community. We come from that community, and Salim will remember maybe at Rhodes, just the difficulty of trying to talk about community engagement when you're the black person in the room, because you're already engaging. That community there is the one you're coming from right now. That's the way you're sending your salary. So now when your white colleague is busy being funny, they are doing community engagement because they don't live there. And now I'm doing double community engagement because not only do I live there, now I must go back and pretend to be an academic engaging people. But then I know the university I represent may be alienating to people. So again, I don't think we know what we yet mean as an intellectual class or an elite class when we say common good in terms of that community. So yeah, then Premesh, here's one last thing for you. Isn't it that we need to be more like peasants, and that the derision of the peasant by the intellectual left has been the problem? I mean, every black African here knows that at some point in your life, you're gonna kill an animal ritually on your behalf. And that's just the way it is, right? But now in the university, the left or the liberal left will say, I can't now say this because it's going to offend sensibilities and, you know. But now as the black African, I have to pretend I'm here for your little whitewashed sensibility. We are killing animals ritually when we leave this room, and that is what, and it's conservative. It is not radical, it is conservative, and we will do it. So how does that real reality of Africa actually permeate the university? We are going to kill animals ritually. I don't care if you're vegans in the room.
One last question from Bongani.
Greetings to the Freud Lodge. My name is Obongani Momoti. I'm a student researcher under Prof. Keith's department. I want to make a statement. Hopefully a question will arise from the speaker who is a professor, associate professor from Canada. I quoted a line from what she had said, which says that there is no single definition of decolonization Hence, there are many voices within the university spaces, and probably a program that is definitive and that could be practical could be devised. I think that's not entirely true. I think what the university spaces need to do is to understand the context of the effects of colonization in that particular society that was victim of. For instance, here in South Africa, when we look at colonization, we need to understand the effects that education as the higher education sector or education at large was used as a tool to progress colonization within the context of capitalism. And it was a clear and specific tool. I say this because when Verwoerd became the minister in 1948, he had then contacted a Stellenbosch sociologist lecturer to assist him with that program of advancing the most gruesome stage of colonization, which is apartheid in South Africa. And then I think when we are in university spaces, it becomes dishonest if we expect the institutions of higher learning themselves outside of the political space, outside of the external factors who used education to colonize, and then expect the university space itself to be transformative. I'm saying this because even in a capitalist system, we will miraculously, hopefully, decolonize and transform the university spaces, but it is the university that produces students. It transforms them into skilled labor. So if we transform the university spaces, but then not temper or have or work hand in hand with the external stakeholders who used education as a tool to devise this type of society we live in, we are exercising a futile exercise. Lastly, the professor, doctor, at the end, you posed beautiful questions. Which end? On the right, on the right, about the Techno-Rational Times that we're in. It is said that we're in, I don't find it true, but we're in the fourth industrial revolution. Unfortunately, South Africa, we are not advanced to that stage, but it has elements. But now it poses a question on the institutions of higher learning, understanding the effects of industrialization, that as the mode of production advances, it then creates a crisis of unemployment within a capitalist system, because technology is taking the jobs of the petty labor. I'll coin it that. What then is the duty of the university to make sure that, one, the curriculum can respond to that crisis, and number two, what is the university doing to understand the fact that other institutions of higher learning like TVETs, which produce laborers, which are more practical in nature, how then, what's the duty of higher education and learning in making sure that this techno-rational time within the capitalist system does not create a bigger problem for the crisis at hand? I'm sorry for being long. Thank you.
Thank you for all the questions. So we're going to give Dr. Sharon Stein to give a response. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Before Dr. Sharon Stein comes in, we'll take a question from Prof. Sue.
Thanks very much. Let me lower my hand. Yep. So thanks very much for a very thought-provoking session of provocations and counter-disputations. And I'm just thinking a bit about, I know Walter Mignolo has been mentioned a few times, and he has this long, very long essay on delinking, and in which he talks about the rhetoric of coloniality, which is this exclusive pensée unique of the West and the rest. Its logic, which is a logic of othering, and of course, through the lens of structure and technology of racialization, especially. And then that relates to a grammar of liberation, which he takes to be delinking. But as Professor Lalu has troubled us with, could be this liberation could be liberation by Trojan horse, a kind of accursed liberation that brings with it the seeds of reproducing the thing that we were supposed to liberate from. And I'm just reflecting on Sharon Stein's, intervention and reminder that there's no consensus on decolonization. And the reality being that there is also this other consilience of inductions, this other jumping together and creation of a consensus, been very dynamic and has worked very well, both in its original apartheid cybernetic scientific holism, and I think in its new interpretation of neoliberalism. So in a way, they've not been too fussy about how they make their consensus. So my question to you, my provocation to you is, what do we do about this? The fact that we're being very fussy about our consensus to resist this, but we are not really naming this commonplace of the other consensus. And elsewhere, I call this predatory transdisciplinarity. They managed to very successfully create a transdisciplinarity that has served as the grammar. Hence, we have technological determinism and technological rationality as the solutionism that supposedly liberates us as individuals and helps us to optimize ourselves. So what should we do about the fact that this other consensus already exists, and why don't we do more to curse it openly and to name it and to oppose it in a more direct way, to confront it? So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's about the grammar of liberation, and are we really engaging in a structure of thought and action that really brings about a change that is really different? Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. So we're going to give Dr. Sharon Stein an opportunity to respond, and then we'll give Dr. Ndimi and Dr. Bruce and Premesh will sort of do the last. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a great question. So first, I want to just clarify that I absolutely agree that the imperative to map the ways that the university historically and today has been complicit in the creation and reproduction of colonialism is an imperative task. And I don't think there's any question about that. And I actually think that in many cases, many people on that map that I showed at least would like to move, they want to move on in a way before they do the work of actually confronting colonialism. And I think that's probably what many of us here are trying to push back against, which is sort of the wanting to move on without actually having reckoned with the historical and ongoing implications of colonialism, and not only reckoned with, but actually have made reparations. And I think there are many people pushing for decolonization who are pushing for that. But then what I was trying to map was that people respond to the call for decolonization in very different ways. And some respond by dismissing it entirely. Others respond by saying, by interpreting decolonization as inclusion, which in my personal, approach to decolonization is insufficient, because it's simply including more people into a colonial institution. And then there's people all the way on the other end who say, as you kind of suggested, perhaps we cannot decolonize the university because the university itself is a colonial structure. So unless it totally undoes itself, there's nothing that can be decolonized. And at the same time, we can hold that with the possibility of nonetheless trying to push for something different. And actually having that map of how people are responding to the calls for decolonization can be very useful. And it's going to look like a different map depending on what our context is. For me in Canada, it looks very different than what it looks like there. And I wouldn't try or assume to know what it looks like there in great detail. But having a map of the way that people are interpreting this is potentially very useful for then intervening and saying, okay, I see what's happening in this context, and here's where I can push. Here's where I can find allies. And we may not find allies that are exactly in the same place as the map with us, but maybe we find people on the same sort of corner that want to push back against people on the other corner, and working together strategically to see what might be possible. If not to decolonize, because maybe it's not possible, then at least to reduce harm, and work toward the potential possibility of a different future. And I absolutely agree that that cannot be confined to the walls of the university, because the university is not going to be able to solve the problems that it created. And you see them trying. So for instance, in the context of the US, there are more and more universities making apologies for the use of enslaved peoples to build their institutions and the stealing of indigenous land on which to build their institutions. But in many cases, this becomes an opportunity to re-justify their existence. And they say, we are going to, address this by funding more research about it, which on the one hand is important. On the other hand, it's sort of putting money back into itself as opposed to the communities who actually paid the price for the creation and sustenance of these institutions. So there's absolutely a need to interrupt that, but also seeing that sometimes the university calls that decolonization, and we need to be aware of that as we're pushing back on it, but maybe also use it as an opening to suggest that it could mean something else without having the end goal being everyone agrees on what it means, but rather thinking about it strategically as how we might intervene. I hope that made sense. Thank you again. It was a great question.
No, thank you so much. My brother, I'll try to, let me pick from where Sharon ended with this issue of decolonization, which personally I don't subscribe too much into it. I'll tell you why. I think we often reduce that concept into a political kind of debate or discourse, but we forget about, what should be happening for us to say we are actually decolonizing the way we live, the way we talk, the way we relate to each other. But I don't know, what do we want to decolonize? What is it that we want to decolonize? And I understand in South African context, this notion of decolonization has its historical legacy or historical attachment element to it. But if you go to other countries in out of South Africa, the conversation is very different. In fact, if you go like in Tanzania, you talk about decolonization, what is that? They've never heard about it. Although we need to think about how do we decolonize our, for instance, curriculum? Is it still colonial oriented? How do we do that? But I think we need to think about what are the practices that we need to decolonize? How do we talk when we're in the corridor? How do I see you? How do you see me? How do I see Andre? Those are kind of things we should be thinking about before we talk about we need to decolonize, curriculum or teaching. That we can talk about we can engage later. Going back to the issue of what universities need to do with the issues of, let's say, of unemployment, I think we need to not to treat university as a panacea to all the problems that are happening in society. Otherwise, we run into trouble. Because these are institutions which operate in a structure, in a context which there are many actors that have to be involved. They have their own core functions that they need to protect. the technologies of teaching and learning and research. They need to protect those. Those are core functions. But they can't run away from producing graduates who don't fit, in the society or in the labor market. They can't run away from that. So, but we shouldn't treat them as, university as being the solution to issue of unemployment. They could be part of contributing to unemployment, but also they are not the solution to that. So there are many actors who also must be involved in that process of addressing the unemployment, not only in South Africa. And I gave an example when I was talking. In Tanzania, you'll be surprised to see the number of unemployed graduates out there. And those are graduates. What about those who are unskilled and uneducated? So there are many issues that universities need to grapple with, but they are not the solutions to that. Coming to your question of community, and I'm not doing marketing here, but I do speak about that issue of community, the way we talk about community. How do we define a community? Who is a community? And the moment you talk about community, what comes to your mind? Othering. Those people who are somewhere there, and even a question, I pose a question, who do we engage with often? We look for poor people. And who is poor? Who do you find that this one is poor? I think those are questions that we need to begin to think about when we frame or when we conceive a community. What is it? How does it look like? And when we engage with them, how do we frame our programs? It has to be informed. And who decides what should be done to them? Those are important questions we should think about. Thank you.
Thanks, colleague. I'm going to latch on to the response on community. I think we've also problematized the concept in our reimagination as well. And so when we think of community, we don't necessarily think of geographic anymore, but we think of a group of people that you might be engaging for a specific purpose around certain reason, and that is layered in itself as well. So when we come to the geographic and spatial engagement with community, that's informed by context. Who's in that particular context? How do we engage in that particular context? So that's a broad definition that we try to embrace in thinking about community and the multiple communities that we engage with. My thoughts on some of the other comments is that I think it's the ability for me is to sit in constant tension with some of these complexities that engage around some of the meta challenges that I think are confronting the university, and how the university wants to locate itself in response to these meta challenges. I think that comes out in the messaging, and I think historically, and your knowledge is vast on this, is this notion that do we use this historical opportunity to develop some contemporary responses while being reflective on the historical challenges that have brought us to this particular point?
Thank you, Wonstein. So just very briefly, the colleague from Makerere, petty apartheid, I see as the end point of that question that got raised in the early 20th century by African nationalists, intellectuals. They were beginning to point out that there's something on the horizon that is looking like education could not solve. So many of them went to study, as you know, and they thought education was an escape hatch. And they came back and they realized that actually there was something else brewing on the horizon. I'm saying that what we see, when you think ahead, is you see in petty apartheid all the worries they had about the attachments of race, as Stuart Hall would say, as a slippery signifier, floating signifier to this question of technology. So Africa's modernization, which is where we talk about decolonization, but Africa was a continent of modernization. All the nationalist movements had programs of modernization, starting with Ghana at the point of independence. And Nkrumah's big programs were modernization programs. So modernization has run aground in many ways, as has development of underdevelopment, and so on and so forth. So very quickly, what was happening in that space was this delinking, to use this word, of sense and perception. So, and I've got a long thing in the book. This lab was set up in 1920 in Leipzig. The same lab was set up at Stellenbosch University in 1917. Verwoerd was educated in that lab. Verwoerd's dissertation is called The Blunting of Emotions. And he goes in 1926 to go to this lab where they are working with Americans, Münsterberg in particular, on how to create industrial psychology as a discipline, psychotechniques, how to intervene in people's psychic structures. So I'm arguing that the work here of aesthetic education is actually to rework and relink sense and perception, which brings me to the worry about delinking in Minolo's work. I mean, I'm okay with Samir Amin's articulation of delinking, but I'm trained in the traditions of Edward Said. And Said worried very much about partition. I mean, coming from the Middle East and thinking about Israel, Palestine, but when he spoke in Cape Town, he kept saying Eritrea, Ethiopia, I mean, all the Cold War, North Korea, South Korea, all these partitions that came up after the Second World War are legacies that we still live with today. And they are sources of enormous warfare across the world. So, I think that there's a way in which we cannot avoid the question of partition as much as we want to decolonize, which I think is always underway anyway. But the thing here is about, I want to point out the colleague at the back, Bongani. The thing here is that for me, slavery is the condition that touches this entire continent. Even the colleagues in Ethiopia will tell you, no, we weren't colonized, But the question of slavery is available to them, as it is in Ghana, as it is here on our doorstep. Hinsa Kapalo is killed because there's an accusation of the practice of slavery against him. And it's 1834, the British have abolished slavery, and what they do is they hold the Xhosa king responsible for keeping the Hlubi and the so-called Mfengu as slaves. So slavery is at the heart of the formation of our racial system across the length and breadth of this continent. And I would say that, when we engage in this project of the university, we must have the figure of the slave available. The failure to keep the slave available was what sold the university to the bourgeois public sphere and to capital. And I'm saying, no, if we make that same mistake again, we are destroying a very crucial part of the intellectual history and consequences of the kind of intellectual formations on this continent. And then, Nomalanga, great questions. I mean, the black management, these universities were set up, my university, to control populations. That's what they were. I mean, so there's no medicine, engineering, none of those disciplines, not even the arts were allowed. The arts were only allowed at Fort Hare. Bantu arts is what they called it, right? So the black management concept, right, is with us because the formations of knowledge have trained people in the management of populations. I mean, in Mandani's terms, I mean, I don't often quote him, but, for various reasons. I mean, we're not, okay, let's just leave that there. The problem of decentralized despotism, is that the training of the management of populations in a system of indirect rule was underway all the time. Petty apartheid accommodated that very well, You policed yourself into submission. And we mustn't forget that, we are marked by not only the legacies of slavery, we are marked by the legacies of apartheid that made us conduct our own oppression and police our own oppression. And then just the thing about the rural in the urban and the rural in the university, I've been very interested in that. I mean, we've dislodged, most of our universities in South Africa are rural universities. They're not urban universities, and they don't all have statues of Cecil John Rhodes. They are rural universities the question here is about rural women. There are large numbers of rural women in these universities. So I've always said to people that the work that we need to do in relation to the rural is not reculturalize the rural, but to think about, what beyond the questions of subjectivity and ethnicity and so on, are we to link up with in the rural? In other words, what process of learning to learn? And I've worked in a rural area in Cape Town for 10 years in Barrydale. And I can tell you, the big thing there was fetal alcohol syndrome. 300 years of poisoning people by paying them in alcohol has left the society completely devastated. Yet in 10 years, between 94 and 2010, not a single kid from that region entered university. Through the simple instrumentality of a puppet, of a giant puppet, and these are beautifully, they're not just the Muppets, they are beautifully created by Handspring. with the local community. We now have 70 people in a higher education institution. So that work of creating a conduit to the university where the rural actually presents itself as a proposition within the university is going to be absolutely critical for us. I don't know if that's an adequate answer to your question, but I do think, I want to plug again here, that I don't think that you can think Africa without seriously thinking the question of slavery and partition.
Thank you for the engagement. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our session. We can't take another round in anticipation of the load shedding. Thank you.
Thank goodness there's load shedding. We can start.
Yeah. So,
thank you so much. But it's just to be back around 8 o'clock. Sorry. My apologies.
Yeah, so yes, to just clarify on Andre's point, at 6 o'clock there will be cocktail snacks for those who are in person, and then we'll start with the session, which is the Critical University Studies South Africa session, at 6:30. Hopefully after the lights have gone back to the mains. Yeah, just a reminder for those who would like to do a walking tour of campus, I'll meet you outside this entrance at 4:20. And there should be some tea outside for those who want. I think that's all for now. Right. Thanks, everyone.